Today, we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters, the Rwandan genocide of 1994. You've given us excerpts from
Leave none to tell the story.
Leave None to Tell the Story, yeah, a Human Rights Watch report. And I have to admit, even just skimming it, the level of detail is overwhelming.
Yeah.
But this isn't just about recounting horrific events, right? We're here to uncover the mechanisms of genocide, the warning signs, and ultimately how something like this could happen.
You're absolutely right. And to understand the how, we need to go back to to Rwanda before the genocide. There's this common misconception that Rwanda was always divided by these ancient, irreconcilable tribal hatreds, which is inaccurate.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was Rwandan society actually like before colonialism?
Imagine a complex tapestry of pastoralist and agriculturalist communities, the cattle herders and the farmers.
Right.
Power dynamics shifted constantly, but the identities we now associate with Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa were much more fluid. Think of it more as socioeconomic roles than fixed ethnic categories.
So then how did this idea of Hutu and Tutsi as distinct, separate groups become so deeply entrenched?
That's where Belgian colonialism comes in. And unfortunately, it's a textbook example of how racist ideologies of the time twisted and manipulated existing social structures.
Right.
The Belgians, influenced by these flawed theories, imposed a rigid racial hierarchy, deciding that the Tutsi minority were somehow inherently superior to the Hutu.
And they didn't just favor them socially, right? They actually institutionalized this whole fabricated hierarchy.
Exactly. They introduced identity cards and a census that formally classified every single Rwandan as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This might seem like just bureaucratic paperwork, but it had devastating consequences. It essentially codified racial division into law.
It's almost unfathomable that an outside power could just come in and reshape the society's entire understanding of itself.
And it gets even more insidious. The report highlights how some Rwandan historians actually collaborated in this construction of a Tutsi superiority narrative.
Wait, really? Why would they do that?
Well, there were likely a number of factors at play.
Yeah.
Some historians might have genuinely believed these theories.
Right.
But for many, it was likely a matter of self-preservation. Collaborating with the Belgians meant access to power, resources, and social standing. It's a tragic example of how easily intellectual dishonesty can be used to solidify power structures.
So this manufactured racial divide, this idea of Hutu and Tutsi as inherently different and opposed, that's the foundation upon which the genocide was built.
Precisely. And the effects reverberated long after Rwanda gained independence.
So what happened when the Belgians left? Did things get better?
Not exactly. The power dynamic flipped with the Hutu majority now in control, but the cycle of violence continued. The report details how Hutu leaders, instead of dismantling this fabricated racial hierarchy, actually exploited it to their advantage. They used the same tools of violence and propaganda, only this time it was directed against the Tutsi.
So the cycle of oppression just continued, just with different players.
Sadly, yes. And to make matters worse, this violence became deeply intertwined with economic gain. The report points out how Hutu stood to profit materially from the displacement and persecution of Tutsi. Land, businesses, even personal belongings were seized, creating a perverse incentive for violence.
It's deeply disturbing how easily human suffering can be exploited for personal gain. But it wasn't just about brute force, right? There was a calculated campaign of misinformation at play as well.
Absolutely. The rise of the Hutu power movement was fueled by a propaganda machine that was as effective as it was terrifying. They understood the power of controlling the narrative, and they expertly utilized the media, particularly radio, to spread their message of hate and fear.
And that's where the infamous RTLM radio station comes in. This wasn't just some fringe operation, right?
No, RTLM was a powerful tool for inciting violence against the Tutsi. They were incredibly savvy, using radio to dehumanize the Tutsi population, painting them as the enemy within. They spread rumors, fueled conspiracy theories, and ultimately made violence seem not just acceptable, but necessary.
The report actually shares excerpts from some of these broadcasts. Do any specific examples stand out?
There's a chilling speech from 1992 by Leon Mugezera, a prominent figure in the Hutu power movement. He explicitly called for the elimination of the Tutsi, using incredibly disturbing language.
What kind of language were we talking about?
He spoke about sending them back to Ethiopia via the Nabarongo River, a clear euphemism for mass murder.
Oh, wow.
The river was often used to dispose of bodies, so his words were not just rhetoric, but a blatant call to action.
So at this point, the seeds of genocide are clearly being sown. And amidst all this, The Tutsis weren't just sitting idly by, right?
No, you're right. We also need to consider the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, in this escalating conflict. They were comprised mainly of Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier violence, and they invaded Rwanda in 1990, triggering a civil war.
So the RPF were fighting back against this oppressive regime, but did they engage in any violence themselves?
The report doesn't shy away from the complexities. While the RPF was primarily fighting for the rights and safety of the Tutsi people, they also committed acts of violence against civilians, although on a smaller scale compared to the Hutu power movement.
So it's not a simple black and white, good versus evil narrative.
Exactly. Understanding the Rwandan genocide requires acknowledging the multifaceted nature of the violence, understanding the motivations and actions of all parties involved.
It's a stark reminder that even in the face of oppression, the lines between victim and perpetrator can become blurred. And in the midst of this escalating conflict, with the RPF fighting back, were there any attempts at peace?
Yes, in fact, there were. The Arusha Accords, signed in 1993, aimed to end the civil war and establish a power-sharing government. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to step back from the brink.
But it didn't work. What happened?
Tragically, the accords were ultimately undermined by Hutu hardliners who saw them as a direct threat to their power. Figures like Colonel Thanis Bagosora, a prominent Hutu power figure, actively prepared for genocide while these peace talks were going on.
So while diplomats were working towards peace, these extremists were already plotting mass murder.
It's a chilling example of how deeply entrenched the ideology of ethnic cleansing had become. They were determined to cling to power, even if it meant orchestrating a genocide. And tragically, the event that triggered their horrific plan was the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994.
The report mentions that there's still debate surrounding the assassination. What are the prevailing theories?
It remains a point of contention to this day.
Right.
Some believe it was orchestrated by Hutu extremists to provide a pretext for the genocide.
Hmm.
Others point fingers at the RPF, suggesting they wanted to destabilize the government and seize power. But the truth is, the exact details are still shrouded in mystery.
So regardless of who was responsible, the assassination was the spark that ignited the genocide.
Precisely. Hutu extremists, already poised to strike, seized upon this event and launched their meticulously planned extermination campaign.
And just how systematic and organized was this campaign?
This was a genocide orchestrated from the highest levels of government, reaching down to the very fabric of Rwandan society.
Wow.
Government officials, the military, the Interahamwe militia, they all played a part.
You mentioned the Interahamwe. Can you explain who they were?
The Interahamwe were a Hutu paramilitary organization, essentially a youth militia that became central to carrying out the genocide. They were trained and armed, often by the government itself, and they roamed the countryside, terrorizing and killing Tutsi civilians.
The report details the horrifying brutality of the killings. I was particularly struck by the widespread use of machetes.
Yes, that's a truly chilling aspect of this genocide. The use of machetes underscores the horrific intimacy of the violence. It wasn't just about killing from a distance, it was about up-close personal brutality, inflicting pain and terror.
It's almost impossible to comprehend that level of hatred, that willingness to inflict such suffering on fellow human beings.
And just when you think it can't get any worse, you learn about the government's tactic of broadcasting pacification messages.
Pacification messages, what were those?
They were radio broadcasts urging people to stop the killing and return home, promising safety and security.
So, calls for peace.
Not exactly. It was a diabolical strategy. They were exploiting people's hope for peace, luring Tutsi out of hiding only to be killed. Imagine the cruelty of giving people false hope just to betray them in the most horrific way imaginable.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
And amidst this unimaginable horror, the international community stood by, largely silent and inactive. The report details the tragic failure of the world to intervene and stop the genocide.
Why was there such a lack of action? Were people not aware of what was happening?
The information was there.
Yeah.
Reports were coming out, pleas for help were being made, but the world chose to turn a blind eye. The UN peacekeeping forces, already limited in their mandate, were ultimately withdrawn, leaving the Rwandan people completely defenseless.
The report specifically mentions Romeo Dallaire, the UN commander, who desperately pleaded for reinforcements, but his pleas were ignored.
Dallaire's story is a testament to the dangers of political apathy and the deadly consequences of inaction. He witnessed the horrors unfolding firsthand and desperately tried to get the world to pay attention, to intervene, but his warnings fell on deaf ears.
The report is incredibly critical of countries like the US, Belgium, and France, stating that they were more concerned with protecting their own interests than saving innocent lives.
It's a dark chapter in international relations, a stark reminder of how national self-interest can trump humanitarian obligations. The reluctance of these powerful nations to intervene, to even acknowledge the genocide as it was happening, is a stain on our collective conscience.
It's difficult to grapple with the scale of this tragedy, the sheer magnitude of the suffering, but it's a story we need to tell, a history we need to confront.
Absolutely. The Rwandan genocide wasn't just a product of ancient tribal hatreds. It was a meticulously planned campaign fueled by political opportunism, ethnic prejudice, and a horrifyingly effective propaganda machine. And the world's inaction, its failure to intervene, allowed this horror to unfold unchecked.
So the genocide finally ended when the RPF emerged victorious in July of 1994. But what happened in the aftermath?
The aftermath of the genocide was, of course, incredibly difficult. Millions were displaced, countless families were shattered, and the entire nation was grappling with the unimaginable trauma of what had transpired.
The sheer scale of the violence? The speed at which it unfolded? It's hard to imagine how anyone could begin to heal from such an experience.
And in the face of such overwhelming horror, the question of justice becomes paramount. The report details the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or ICTR, which was tasked with prosecuting those responsible for the genocide.
Was the ICCR successful in bringing the perpetrators to justice?
The ICTR, while a landmark moment in international justice, faced significant challenges. The sheer number of perpetrators, the difficulties in gathering evidence in a war-torn nation, and the political sensitivities surrounding the conflict made the process incredibly complex and slow.
The report highlights the fact that many Rwandans felt the ICTR was too slow, too removed from their lived experience.
Yes, there were criticisms. Many felt that justice was being delivered from afar, that it wasn't truly addressing the root causes of the genocide.
So did the ICTR ultimately fail?
The ICTR did achieve some measure of justice, prosecuting high-ranking officials and those most responsible for the genocide. But it also had limitations. It couldn't address the widespread complicity, the fact that ordinary citizens had participated in the killings.
So the pursuit of justice for the Rwandan genocide, it's a complex process that goes beyond just punishing a few individuals.
Exactly. It requires addressing the systemic issues that made such a tragedy possible. It's about fostering reconciliation between communities, about confronting the deeply ingrained ethnic prejudices, and about ensuring that such horrors never happen again.
So after this deep dive into the horrors of the Rwandan genocide and the complex factors that led to it, the question that keeps coming up for me is, what can we actually do with this knowledge? How do we prevent something like this from ever happening again?
That's the essential question the report grapples with as well. And it doesn't offer easy answers, but it does provide some concrete steps. One of the most crucial points is the need for early warning systems. We need international mechanisms in place that can detect and respond to the warning signs of genocide before they escalate into full-blown atrocities.
It seems like common sense. But I guess it's easy for those warnings to get lost in the noise, or for people to simply not want to believe that something so horrific could be happening.
That's precisely what happened in Rwanda. The report is very clear in its condemnation of the international community's failure to act, even when the warning signs were flashing bright red.
Right.
Bureaucratic inertia, political maneuvering, and a lack of political will allowed the genocide to unfold despite clear indications that something terrible was brewing.
So we need to be more aware, more vigilant, and less willing to dismiss those early warning signs as exaggerations or isolated incidents.
Exactly. But it's not just about international organizations and governments.
Right.
We as individuals have a responsibility as well. We need to educate ourselves, stay informed about what's happening in the world, and support organizations that are working to prevent genocide and promote human rights.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these problems, to think that our individual actions can't really make a difference.
But that kind of apathy is exactly what allows these atrocities to continue. Every voice raised against injustice, every act of support for those who are suffering, every effort to promote understanding and tolerance, all of these contribute to building a world where genocide is no longer a possibility.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, understanding that an attack on one group of people is an attack on all of us.
Precisely. And it's about refusing to be bystanders. It's about taking a stand against hatred, prejudice, and violence in all its forms. We have to remember that the Rwandan genocide wasn't inevitable. It was the result of choices, actions, and inactions. And we have the power to make different choices, to act differently, to build a world where such horrors are relegated to the history books.
So if we had to distill this entire deep dive into one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be? What's the most important thing they can do?
I think it comes down to this knowledge is power. The more we understand about the mechanisms of genocide, the warning signs, the factors that contribute to it, the better equipped we are to prevent it.
Learning about these dark chapters in history isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about equipping ourselves to build a better future.
Exactly. By learning from the mistakes of the past, by understanding the dynamics of hatred and violence, we can work together to create a world where genocide is no longer a threat.
This deep dive has certainly been a heavy one, but it's left me feeling, I don't know, a strange mix of sadness and a renewed sense of purpose.
I understand that feeling. It's a lot to process, but I think that discomfort is a good thing. It means we're engaging with these issues, that we're not letting the horrors of the past fade into oblivion.
And I hope our listeners are feeling that same sense of purpose. The Rwandan genocide was a horrific tragedy, but it also serves as a powerful reminder of our collective responsibility to prevent such atrocities from happening again.
It's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent, that we all have a role to play in building a more just and peaceful world.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. This has been an incredibly insightful and challenging deep dive, and I hope our listener has come away with a deeper understanding of the Rwandan genocide and the crucial lessons it holds for all of us.
I agree, and I hope it sparks further exploration and discussion.
If this deep dive has raised any questions for you or sparked a desire to learn more, we've included some resources in the show notes that you can check out. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these dark chapters in history, the better equipped we are to prevent them from repeating themselves.
The fight against genocide is an ongoing one, and we all have a part to play.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Rwandan genocide. Let's honor the memory of those who were lost by working together to create a world where such horrors are never repeated.